Did you do attendance already?
Say that again?
Yeah. You did?
What's that?
You did attendance already?
Yeah, I knew you were here. Don't worry.
Okay.
You're hard to miss.
Okay.
Actually, you were here yesterday afternoon, weren't you?
Yes.
I saw you walking
I
across the room.
have, yeah, I have chemistry.
Yeah, okay. Anyways, before we go on to today's actual material, I want to do a quick safety orientation. So I just want to be sure I say this for everybody's benefit at the end of the semester, just cover everything. I want to start with a few things that are really campus-wide and then kind of bring things into what's for this department, for this room, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I want to mention is if you need to call for emergency services, do not use 911. Instead, use 3911. This is actually just the phone number to the campus police department and a special line they have for emergency response. So it's really 413-755-3911. If you happen to be dialing that from one of the system phones, one of these black things that are attached to the wall, then just dial 3911. But if you're using your cell phone, then please dial the full 10-digit number, 413-755-3911. There are some placards down on the first floor in the cafe area, I know that say that stuff. It's good to get that out there. We have first responders here on campus that get here much quicker than the 911 operator can get anybody on campus. So somebody from, I think it's building 9, I can't remember, whatever the police department building is. There are people that'll rush right over here as soon as we call, so they get here. Also, if you were to just call the 911 operator and say, I'm in building 2, I need an ambulance, they don't necessarily know where building 2 is. If you haven't noticed, the building number system here isn't very sensible. This is building 2, the next building 13, which is next building 17, which is next building 27, which is next building 20, which is across from building 7, 8, 9. So if you just say building number whatever, they won't know where that is. But if you call 3911 and we need somebody on campus, then the campus police will coordinate with 911 and get them to the right place. Also, if an ambulance comes on campus, they have to go all the way around the speed bumps and come around this building. But if the front gate, which is run by the campus police, knows that somebody's coming, they'll shut down traffic on this little road out here so that the ambulance can drive the opposite. I mentioned that because it's actually been used a few times in my classes. One time, a student who worked third shift didn't eat breakfast before coming into the 8 o'clock class, and so she passed out at being in class. So the take-home message from that, please eat breakfast before you come in. The second time it happened, it was actually a night class during the regular semester, but there was a student, I think she was sitting right there actually. I was up front presenting material, sitting on that front table there, and she just face planted into the desk in front of her. And the person sitting next to me, sorry?
It was your practice.
Actually, it was right before the practice.
That's why.
Actually, what it was is that she was getting married that weekend. She had either just traveled to, or her honeymoon was, she was traveling to Brazil, where her fiance is from. So if she had just traveled to, she had just met her in-laws, or if she was getting married that weekend, she was about to meet her in-laws. And then the practical was the next week. So the take-home message from that is don't do anything else besides aim people. Actually, what it was is she had a heart condition, and so all the stress that was going on in her life, her BP dropped, and so she fainted. The person sitting next to her, they were good friends, and knew what was going on, knew her condition, and was able to help immediately. And in fact, that person worked in the healthcare field, and so was very helpful in dealing with that and giving the appropriate information to the responders when they showed up. So really the take-home message there is if you have any medical conditions that might be useful for us to know if there's ever an issue, it'd be good if you let somebody know. You do not have to let me know, it's personal information, you're not required to share that with me. But if there's somebody in class that you're comfortable with and you want to let them know, feel free. Usually when I say this, over the next week, I'll find out that I have 3 or 4 people in my classes that are diabetic. So if there is anything that is relevant, feel free to share it with me or somebody else. I will not share your personal information with anybody else. It'll just be helpful if it's needed in something. And then the third time that it happened is actually me. And this actually kind of goes to the personal medical information. It was in the summer. It was about 9:45, which means I was coming up on just about taking a break. And I was up front and I was lecturing. And as I was standing there pointing at the screen and lecturing, I started to feel a little bit woozy. So I sat down on my stool there, but I kept going. I finished the lecture because I'm just that kind of guy. And so it was, 9:45, and I finished a sentence that I was saying. And so I dismissed everybody for the break. During the break, I was sitting up there, and I thought I'd try standing up and walking to my office or something like that. And as soon as I stood up, I knew I wasn't going to do any walking. So I sat back down, and I used my cell phone, and I called 413-755-3911 and had them come up because I have a cardiac condition. And so in sort of keeping with the idea of letting people know about cardiac medical conditions, since it actually has impacted classes before, I'll let you know that I was born with a heart defect and I have various issues with my heart, which I will describe in a bit more detail when we get to the cardiac section of the course. But in that case, I didn't know what was going on. I had in the past had to be hospitalized because of a drop in blood pressure, so I thought the same thing was going on. From all I can figure out, it was actually just an anxiety attack of some sort or something like that. That morning, the Blackboard system erased some information, so I thought that people's work had been lost or something like that, and I was quite upset about it. Turned out to all work out in the end, but I got to spend a nice weekend at Ph.D. So also going with that, I'd like to say if anything comes up and I'm not capable of calling for emergency assistance myself, if you have to call 3911, please do not have me go to these Ph.D. The cardiology department of Ph.D., I don't quite see eye to eye on issues. They didn't seem to understand that I understand what's going on with my heart, and they were sure I'd had a heart attack. And I knew I hadn't had a heart attack. And I knew that surgery I had in my heart when I was a kid left scars consistent with a heart attack. And they just wouldn't believe me. And they wanted me to take me in for surgery to put in a pacemaker and all this crap. So eventually security was called in and I finally got discharged. So please, if I have to go somewhere, send me to Mercy. I have to either go to Bay State or Mercy. There's a law that I can't go past 2 major trauma centers in the neighborhoods. They have to take me. Whatever.
Just don't get kicked out of Mercy.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say, well, drive south, because Mercy and Bay State go north.
Yeah.
Actually, wherever I go, if it happens again, my wife is just going to come and transport me herself. We'll see. The weird thing is, I don't want to get on the
Yeah.
I didn't even drug this. So, so those are 3 examples where that was actually needed in this class. The other thing that's kind of, and that's campus-wide, anywhere on campus, 3911. If you're out on the green space with your cell phone, dial 413-755-3, whatever, and somebody get out to you much easier from our police department. The other thing that's campus-wide is about evacuation. Any room that you're in should have a white placard like this on the wall next to the door, telling what to do if there's an evacuation. If there is, the fire alarm, that red thing up on the top will start flashing, we'll hear a klaxon, and a voice will come on saying something like, an emergency has been reported in your area, please proceed to the nearest emergency exit or something like that. And it'll keep repeating over and over again with the alarm. If the alarm goes off and the voice starts to say all that stuff, but then it stops, we can assume that it's not a real alarm. Sometimes in this building, especially because of the cafe on the first floor, the fire alarms get set off by accident, and somebody will cut it off real quick. But if the voice keeps going, that means we need to leave. One year, we had to leave during summer because somebody thought it'd be cool to smoke in the boys' room. Okay? And they threw their cigarette out into the trash and it caught fire.
Was that in college?
Yeah. So things happen sometimes and we might need to do that. The next thing I want to talk about is really kind of a departmental policy. Well, actually, the first thing I want to talk about is the state level issue. So this sign used to be up above the door, but then they painted last winter and they forgot to put the sign up. So it starts by saying no smoking. That's actually a state law. This is a state institution. There's no smoking in state institutions. There's no smoking within 25 feet of the doors of the building. So the blue lines are actually telling you you have to be smoking outside of that radius there. And like I said, over this course, I will actually talk a little bit more about why you should not be smoking at all. So we'll get to that. But at least let's start with you not smoking in the building. The next thing it says is no eating. This is a safety issue. This is a biology lab. There might be things on the countertops here that you touch with your hands. And then if you're holding food, you can get that onto your food and then into your mouth. And that's the easiest way to get pathogens in your system. So you should not be eating here. It's not just no eating during class. It's no eating in this room or any other room. If you do have to eat stuff, please do it outside. I would strongly suggest that you wash your hands before you start eating, or if you have some antibiotic gel or whatever, because of the potential of transmission. This also says no drinking, but you'll notice that I don't really enforce that one. The reason I'm drinking has to do with my cardiac issues. I have low blood pressure, so I have to keep blood volume up. So I have to keep drinking. Also, with as much talking as I do, I need to stay hydrated also. You might need to drink for various reasons. You might need to have caffeine on board or more sugar or something like that to make it through a 4-hour class or something like that. I don't want to take that away from you. I'm not the type of professor that's going to say, well, I'm a professor, I can drink, but you have to follow rules. I'm going to do it, you're going to be able to do it. That includes everything up to, looking up information on tests. That joke didn't work. The one requirement for drinking in this class, however, it has to be a covered container. So travel mug like this, screw top bottle, fine. Nobody has a sippy cup in here. And when I say sippy cup, I just mean something with a straw. I don't mean, the SpongeBob SquarePants thing. But if you go over to Dunkin', you get a nice coffee or something like that with a lid and a straw, that's acceptable. Those are not the most secure containers, so be careful. They can spill. And in fact, somebody was getting up from their desk with one and other things, and it just went flying and splashed in front of somebody else. And I don't quite know how, but none of it got on that person. But there was nice coffee everywhere. I don't want to see any. Oh, there's a second. So yeah, what is it? Anyways, I don't want to see any open containers. I had a person that would go to Dunkin' and get a coffee every morning, come in, take the lid off, and have a little styrofoam cup in front of them. It drove me crazy. So keep the lid on it if it's a cup like that. I also don't want to see pop-top cans. If you need to slam a Red Bull or something like that, please do it out in the hallway. The reason for that is really those kind of drinks have a lot of sugar in them, and if you spill it, it's a breeding place for bacteria that might be in this room. So keep that to a minimum. If you are addicted to those kind of drinks, they have paraphernalia available to people that are that addicted. If you can buy a thing, put on a Red Bull or whatever brand energy drink you drink, to make it a closed container. Make it like a travel mug. So if you need it, it's out there. Just you're allowed to drink things. Just it has to be in a covered container. I have some colleagues who feel differently about that instruction. Some of them will enforce it. Some of them will say, well, it's okay to drink water or something like that. I've already told you why I need to keep liquids in all the time for me, and reasons why you might need to also. but I'm not going to police what is in your cup. Okay? I'm not going to open up something that I can't see to make sure that it's water, or I'm not going to take a water bottle and sniff it to make sure it is in fact water. I'm going to trust you. While caffeine and sugar might be necessary to make it through 4 hours, I'll guarantee you that alcohol will not help. So please wait until after you leave class for anything. Anyways, if for some reason I happen to be spending a weekend at the hospital again, and somebody has to cover the class for me, if they have a different policy, please pay attention to what they have to say. That weekend at Bay State, that should be a movie. Monday, I was able to come in to teach on Monday, and so I had one of my colleagues cover for me, and one of my students had a nice coffee that she got from Dunkin', and my colleague said, "You can't drink that in here," and she said, "Dr. Bo lets us do it, damn it, I'm gonna drink it." And, you know, it's a $4 drink. She wouldn't throw it out. Hopefully it was more like a $2 drink, I don't know. But she wouldn't throw it out, and she made a big stink, and it was surprising when I heard the story. This particular person never had expected to have that kind of attitude towards them. But if somebody is kind enough to help me when I'm in a jam and covering my class for me, please respect whatever rules they want to impose. If they see you drinking because I say it's okay and they say you can't drink, please understand that's the rule. So while I'm back here, I also want to point out this safety shower up here. Because we have a fume hood in this room, it's code to have a safety shower. We don't actually use the fume hood anymore. Back in the early stages of being this building, we used formaldehyde. So we needed a fume hood. We don't use those kind of chemicals anymore, so we don't need the fume hood, but we still have the shower here, and it still has to be inspected under code, so it works. You can't, cut it off or something like that. I point that out because you will probably be back here to get microscope slides at some point in the semester. This is not just a convenient handhold. While it's code to have a shower when you have a hood, it is not code to have a drain. So if you happen to start the shower, the computer lab below us will be very upset. So please don't pull on this. Somebody tests it to be sure that it works. Just be aware of this when you're back in this corner. The other water feature in this room that's slightly more likely to ever be used is the eye wash station up here. I actually just yesterday found a little animation on some social media site I was using that shows somebody using an eye wash station. I need to incorporate that into my safety demonstration. But if you have gotten something in your eyes, there's a big button here that even a blind person could find, and you can rinse your eyes out. Rinse your eyes out. If you're concerned about potentially getting things in your eyes, we do have safety goggles. There's one pair here for some reason still, but there's a, what do we call those? Drawer over there that's labeled safety glasses. So you can get some over there if you need to. And when we got those safety glasses, we also got that poster up there that shows you how ineffective most safety glasses are. So it's just
pretty gory.
What?
It's pretty gory.
Yes, it is. Now, we will not be doing much that involves those kinds of tissues. We do have a blood lab, but hopefully nobody will get a gusher like that. And we don't do anything with red paint as far as I'm concerned. But we do have safety goggles if you feel necessary. We also have gloves here. Some of my colleagues will insist that students buy their own gloves. There are 2 labs that we might need gloves for, as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's fine for 2 days if people use the gloves that we have. If you feel a need to use more gloves, then please buy your own. But for the little bit that I think that we need, what we have here is fine. Over here we have a fire blanket. Not that you can see it, but if somebody's on fire, this is where stop, drop, and roll comes from. And there's also a fire extinguisher back there under where the safety shower is that I didn't point out. But so they are available if we need them. There's never been a use for them with the smoking in the boys' room episode. If I'd known that's what had happened, I could have put it out before the fire alarm went off. But I found out with everybody else when the fire alarm went out that it was happening. So we do have those here. We have a folio here of material safety data sheets. If you're exposed to anything in this room and you want to find out how to handle that, that's the information. Probably the harshest chemical that we have in this room is bleach, and bleach is found in these yellow cap bottles here. Common sense, don't drink it, you're probably okay. It is a dilute bleach solution, so it's not going to harm your skin or anything like that. The other thing that you might be exposed to or likely to be found in this supply cabinet here, they're staining chemicals. And again, as long as you're not drinking them, they probably won't cause any problems. The worst thing that'll happen with staining chemicals, if you get it on you, is you'll be purple for a day or two until your epidermis cycles through and sloughs off those dead cells. So there shouldn't be anything that's terribly problematic, but if you do want to look up anything, we have it there. We're in the process of switching over to a new material safety data sheet system. So those might be a little bit outdated, but they're still pretty much relevant to what's going on here. I think that's everything. Everybody feel safer now? Okay,
Yeah,
so, oh, the other thing I was gonna say, there are a couple of labs that have specific safety instructions, like the blood lab and the urinalysis lab and that sort of thing. So on those days when we're doing them, I'll give you additional safety instructions, and it'll mostly be about waste stream management and sharps containers and that sort of thing. So those will come up when they're relevant in a specific time. So, okay, so I think that's everything I wanted to cover. I do want to actually finally get to a little bit of actual A&P information. We have an hour left, so we might as well squeeze some stuff in. What I usually do at this point, and I'm really sorry that I didn't get to this, I realized last night that I forgot to get the lab people upstairs to prepare for stuff for me. I might have it for next week just because it's an interesting thing, but we have a lot to do next week, so there might not be time for it. But what I usually do is I set up some different sensory sensation stations. So I have a few solutions that I have people taste to see if they can recognize different tastes. Another one for smell, another one for textures that you can feel, that sort of thing. And I completely blanked on that this year, and I didn't get it set up in time. So I might do that some other time for people's benefit. I might have it set up next week and after class if anybody's interested. You can stick around and look at those, but we're not going to get a chance to. And in the context of doing that, I like to talk about some aspects of the special senses or sensory systems. Now, this is the presentation that I put together a long time ago to use with this material. Before I actually use this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about why I use this software. This is essentially in place of using something like PowerPoint. And there's an actual good reason for me to use this rather than PowerPoint, which has to do with the idea of the metaphor that computer programs are based on. So computers are just processing bits of information, ones and zeros. That's what's going on in the computer. But how we interact with the computer is usually based on some sort of metaphor. So PowerPoint is based on the metaphor of the old-fashioned photographic slides. So when I was in graduate school, before these kinds of things were available, when I wanted to do a presentation, when I wanted to show people data from the work that I did, I'd take a photograph through the microscope of what I was looking at, and I'd make a transparent slide that I'd project up onto a screen. And those slides are these little 2-inch by 2-inch squares with a 35mm positive film in it that would project up on the screen. Right? And it was presented using a carousel projector, which you might have seen. In movies sometimes they show vacation photos. You're trapped with somebody, you have to watch all their vacation photos. They're using a carousel projector. And so you push a button, and a slide drops down into the light path, and that gets projected on the screen. And you push a button, that slide jumps out of the light path, moves forward one position, another slide goes down, and you just move sequentially through the slides. That's what PowerPoint is based on. That's why we call them PowerPoint slides, because they represent the idea of what those old photographic slides would be.
the screen aspect ratio that we look at is actually based on 35 millimeter film. It's 35 by 24 aspect ratio on the screen. Bet you didn't know that. But that's where PowerPoint comes from. It's a very linear presentation tool. Now, because of computers, we can be a little bit nonlinear with it, but people are stuck in that metaphor. The metaphor behind this is different. This Prezi website that I use, it's a canvas metaphor. I put everything I want to show on this canvas, and then I can zoom in on the things that I want to concentrate on. I have this laid out on the, on the canvas with information grouped. And it's laid out in kind of a map of the information that we're dealing with. And this is actually fairly relatable to how our brains work. So we can follow this presentation. The way I usually do it is kind of in a spiral format. So from here, we could go to this, and then to this, and then to this, and then to this, and then to that. That's just the way I usually map it out. But within those little clusters, there are relationships between things, and this can use size as an aspect of relationship. So we can look at this canvas and we can see things on here. There's some text that's visible even at this resolution. And those are the important things. So obviously there's a box there. There are three very important things that I want to talk about. Okay. You can tell there's three things there. We can't tell what they are. We have to zoom in on it to see them a little bit better. Okay. And then when we get here, we can see, okay, these are types of receptors. And one type is about the cellular types. One's the type based on location. One's the type based on transduction. And then there are lists underneath that. So it starts to make things less linear and more relational. And so that's why I like to use these presentations, this presentation software. You're welcome to get to this stuff on your own. I showed you where the link is in the syllabus to get to my Prezi profile page. So if you want to go back and look at this stuff again afterwards, or if I'm talking and I'm moving on and you missed something, you can go back and look at it, or if you have a laptop with you, you can stay on that stuff while I move on. Now, it would be possible there are other systems I could use where you could log into the system and what's on your screen is exactly what's on the screen up there, but then you'd be forced to follow what I'm presenting. This way, you can sort of follow the presentation along with me, but you can stay where you want to be if I'm moving on, or you can move out or in to see more detail or the bigger picture as I'm looking at stuff. So you can have this stuff in front of you if you want to. So that's what the presentation software is about. One of the things I keep saying I need to do, and I've not gotten around to it in any real serious sense, is I need to update a lot of these presentations. The artwork in these is based on an old book that I used, actually based on the book that my colleagues are using for A&P right now. So if you took A&P 1 with somebody else, a lot of the artwork that I have in this presentation right now is from the book that you probably have from that. But what I really want to do is I want to switch over that artwork to represent what's in the textbook we have now, that I use now. And so I'm still in that process. And I'm going to try, with the time I have over the summer, to do that more and more. But I'm going to use these presentations to some degree because stuff like this, the text stuff that I have, is really important to how I cover this material. And actually, for the sensory systems, I'm not interested in stressing the idea of special senses versus general senses so much as I am in stressing the idea of how we get sensory information into our system. And so there's two things I want to talk about for that, and that's what I'm going to use for the rest of the day. One, obviously, I want to talk about types of receptors. And then after I show you this stuff, I want to move on and talk about the specific types of senses that we have and how those are received through these receptors and then processed in the nervous system a little bit. So there are obviously three things that I want to talk about here, and they are the three different ways of classifying the types of receptors that we have in our system. Two of those are structural, or based on the anatomy. And one of those is functional, or based on the physiology. In truth, what's most important about how receptors work is how they work, therefore the function or physiological aspect of that. So I want to talk about the two structural components here, but after saying that, we're really going to pay more attention to the functional aspect. And so when I talk about types of receptors after this, I'm really only talking about what is the third type here. Okay? So when we're considering the structure, we can think of receptors either based on what's doing the receiving, what type of cell is doing that. So the first classification is cellular classification. Or we can think about structurally where they are in the body, their location relative to the stimuli that they're receiving. And that's what location is about. So I want to talk about those two real quick. There's essentially 3 bullet points under the cellular thing, which is really about 2 types of cells. We either have neurons that are receiving sensory information directly, or we have special cells that are receiving sensory information and passing that on to neurons. Now, neurons come in 2 different types. They can either be cells that have free nerve endings or cells that have encapsulated endings. Now, those 2 terms you've probably heard before because they're relevant to what we learned about the skin in AMP1. So nervous tissue in the skin is really just nerve endings, having to do with the sensations that our skin can process. And those nerve endings are either free, just dendrites hanging out all by themselves, or they're encapsulated. So the dendrite has other tissue wrapped around it, helping it do its job. Free nerve endings we usually associate with pain and temperature for the most part. The pain receptors are interacting directly with chemicals that have to do with tissue damage. And that's what our sense of pain is, really tissue damage. And then temperature, they have temperature-sensitive proteins in them, either sensitive to cold temperatures or hot temperatures, that cause a membrane potential change based on temperature. Okay. All of the other endings in our skin and other places that have neurons directly doing this are going to generally have encapsulated endings. Okay. So if you looked at this in the skin, and I don't really stress it too much myself in AMP1, you might have had encapsulated endings like a lamellated or Pacinian corpuscle or a Rofidi ending or something like that. In the chapter for this unit, I do have a little table talking about the different types of encapsulated endings, but I'm not going to go through them in depth here. So this picture, which again is from another book, and in fact it's not from the Martini book, it's from an even older book, it's just comparing 2 cells, one that has free endings, so we have the dendrites that would be out in the skin here, or the other one has encapsulated endings. So here the dendrites are surrounded by something. So this would represent a lamellated corpuscle. At the endings, whether they're free or encapsulated, they generate a graded potential, specifically called a receptor potential. I'm not going to tell you what it's called because suddenly I'm getting confused on names, but a graded potential based on how strong the stimulus is. That is going to determine whether action potentials are generated that travel down the axon. Now, these sensory neurons that we're talking about, for the vast majority of cases, are going to be unipolar neurons, and that's what's represented in these 2 pictures. So these are usually going to be unipolar neurons. Their cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglia or cranial nerve ganglia, and the dendrites are in the skin or muscles or joint capsules or tendons or other organ systems, and they send information into the central nervous system. So the cell body that we see in both of these is located in a ganglion in the periphery, and then the axon continues on into the central nervous system. So the synapses that either of these cells make at their axon terminals are going to be on some structure in the central nervous system for the most part. Now, there are some exceptions. The autonomic nervous system that we're going to be covering a little bit next week uses similar types of cells, but they usually have connections, or no, they can have connections in the periphery, so they don't always go out in the central nervous system. But we'll not really talk about that tomorrow too much. And then there are actually some examples of sensory neurons, like in for the sense of smell, that don't look like this. They're bipolar cells, and I'll show you those in a little bit. But they still fall into that group, and they would be free nerve endings. This is a picture out of this is out of the Martini book. This is just showing various types of endings that are associated with the skin. One problem with this picture, this free nerve ending picture here, is just plain wrong. There's no nervous tissue in the epidermis. Free nerve endings would be associated with the basal layer of the epidermis if they're anywhere. What they're probably representing here is actually a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional micrograph. And so those nerve endings that seem to be going up into the epidermis would really be in the dermal papillae in a different plane relative to the drawing that they're drawing here. So I think that's just plain wrong. But there's a few other ones. Here's a lamellated corpuscle down here. Here's what I called a Ruffini corpuscle a second ago, tactile corpuscle. These are Merkel discs. Just some different examples of the kind of things that can be free nerve endings or encapsulated. And then for an example of a receptor cell, this is a taste bud. So other than neurons that are directly interacting with the stimuli, which is mostly happening through the skin and other aspects related to the senses of touch, as well as smell I just mentioned, pretty much everything else has these specialized sensory receptor cells. So what we're looking at here is a taste bud. And some of the cells in here are receptor cells. They're called taste cells in this picture. Some of them are structural cells for the taste bud. They're not related to the sensation, but rather like the basal cells pointed out here. They have to do with the structure of the taste bud. And then we see here the nerve that's connected to the receptor cell. So these receptor cells are not neurons. The neuron, we see its dendrite here that's connecting to the receptor cell, and then the axon continuing on to the ganglion, and eventually it's going to go into the central nervous system. These cells are, if I remember correctly, actually not even nervous tissue derived. They're epithelial cells, or related to epithelial cells. But they're specialized in that they have protein receptors in their in the cell membrane that are sensitive to the chemicals of taste. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And then they release neurotransmitters at the connection they make with the gustatory afferent nerve, as it's labeled there. They're not neurons. They don't make action potentials. They do have membrane potential changes, and they release neurotransmitters, but they're not neurons themselves. So this is an example of that. Another example, and I think actually, as I talk about this in the book, instead of a taste cell like this, I use a photoreceptor as an example in the book. But that's another example of a specialized receptor cell that's not a neuron. So that's one way of looking at the cells, just what type of cell it is, neuron versus not neuron. And of the neurons, it can be a free nerve ending or an encapsulated nerve ending cell. The other way of thinking about receptor cells is structurally is in terms of their location. Where are they in relation to the stimuli that they're responsible for? So we have exteroreceptors, which are receptors that are in a location to deal with external stimuli. Anything that we're consciously, well, I shouldn't say that. Most things that we're consciously aware of fall into this group. So our sense of vision or a sense of hearing or a sense of touch, taste, smell, et cetera, those are all based on exteroreceptors because they're dealing with external stimuli. And the opposite of that would be interoreceptors. And those are things that we're usually not consciously aware of. Those are usually stretch receptors or something like that in organs. So you don't have a conscious perception of your blood pressure, but there are receptors in the walls of your blood vessels that report that information to your nervous system. Okay, so there are stretch receptors in the wall of blood vessels, and as the blood vessel wall stretches out as blood pressure increases, those interoreceptors report that information to part of your nervous system that's not involved with conscious perception. Now, there are some interoreceptors that end up making it to the level of conscious perception, like when your stomach is full. You can usually feel that. And the reason that you feel that is usually that the easiest way to stop you from eating is to feel that stretch receptor in your stomach being active. Then behaviorally, you'll say, oh God, I can't eat another bite. You know, that kind of thing. It would seem that should cover everything. Exteroreceptors are receptors that deal with external stimuli. Interoreceptors are receptors that deal with internal stimuli. So there shouldn't be a third group there, it seems like, but in fact there is. Proprioreceptors are special kinds of receptors. A simple way of describing them that I like to use, proprioreceptors are basically interoreceptors that we treat like exteroreceptors. Okay. Or another way of thinking of that is they are receptors that are incorporated into internal tissues, but they give us information about us in relation to the outside world. Now, proprioreceptors are responsible for what we call proprioception. Proprioception, and for some weird reason, the RE in reception just gets dropped out of that word, is our sense of self. That's what the word really means. And what it refers to is our sense of body position and our body movement. Okay? So the receptors are stretch receptors in our muscles and our joints and our tendons, and pressure receptors in our joints, and some receptors in our skin that are activated as our body's moving. While that's all telling us about internal states, what's happening in our muscles and our joints and et cetera, we use it to understand how we are moving or positioned in response to the world around us, or in relation to the world around us. So it's a special kind of class there. Okay? So they're sort of internal receptors, but they're dealing with our perception of the world around, of us in relation to the world around us. Okay. Now, as I was setting this up, I said there's three types. Two of them are structural, which are the ones that I went through. And then the third type is functional, which is about transduction. And really, this is the main way that we classify receptor cells. Generally speaking, if I'm asking you about classifying receptor cells, this is what I'm talking about. Their functional relationship to cells. The cellular or location aspect is useful to understand something about the system, but this is really the important part about sensory perception. Now, the word transduction means literally to carry across. And what it's referring to is taking a stimulus and carrying it across this threshold, so to speak, into our nervous system. So this is how we transfer stimuli information into nervous system signaling, active potentials. Okay? And so these cells are all referring to how they do that. And for the most part, their names are basically something receptor, and that something is referring to the type of stimulus they deal with. So we have mechanoreceptors for mechanical stimuli, thermoreceptors for temperature stimuli, photoreceptors for light stimuli, chemoreceptors for chemical stimuli. Nociceptor is an unusual word. One, in this list I've given you, is the one that doesn't have receptor, it just says ceptor. And again, it's a little quirk in how these words are made. And I guess it's Latin, Greek, I don't know, whatever. But the root of this word, noci, you're actually familiar with that root. Not in that form. You're more familiar with it when the root has an X instead of a C. Okay. So what's a word that has N-O-X-I as its root? What?
You're just going to say maxima.
Well, that would be
That's not
N-O-X-E, and not relevant here. The word that you're probably most familiar with, which is coming to mind because of that root's kind of buried in it, is obnoxious. Okay. In terms of stimuli, we can use the word noxious. So noxious stimuli activate nociceptors. Now, obnoxious or noxious, whichever we're talking about, the root is referring to painful stimuli. Okay? So somebody who is obnoxious sort of causes some sort of pain, not necessarily physical pain, but you don't want to be around that obnoxious person. Noxious stimuli are things that we perceive as pain. Now, nociceptors generally are chemoreceptors. Because our sense of pain is really a sense of tissue damage. When tissue is damaged or when tissue is at threat of being damaged, it will release chemicals, and those chemicals will activate nociceptors. Or sometimes chemicals are released when tissue is damaged because cells have just broken open. And the presence of things that are supposed to stay inside cells, being in the external space, ends up activating them too. There are two molecules I want to talk about that you're probably most familiar with having to do with nociceptors. One you won't recognize by name, and those are prostaglandins. You've probably not really heard of prostaglandins before, but they're very important in terms of how we deal with pain. Prostaglandins are released during the inflammatory response. So if we damage tissue or we're in a disease situation, tissue starts releasing these chemicals called prostaglandins, and they bind to nociceptors, and they generate the pain we associate with those states. We take drugs that block the production of prostaglandins on a regular basis. I bet all of you have taken one at least once this week. And those drugs are anything related to aspirin. Okay? Aspirin, ibuprofen, Aleve, Motrin, Midol, all those kinds of things, those belong to a class of drugs called NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The way they work is they block an enzyme, and that enzyme is responsible for making prostaglandins. And so by taking that drug, you stop your body from producing prostaglandins, and you have less pain. Okay? Now, when we get to the immune system, I'm actually going to talk about prostaglandins. When we get to the endocrine system, I'm going to talk about prostaglandins a bit more because they have to do with endocrine signals in the immune system. The other molecule that you're probably familiar with, and again, you might not know it by name, but you've probably experienced it, is capsaicin. Capsaicin is the active ingredient in peppers. How hot a pepper is, how hot, jalapeno, ghost, habanero, whatever, is really directly related to how much capsaicin is present in that pepper. What capsaicin does is it binds to nociceptors. But what's unusual is it doesn't let go. Usually when things bind to a receptor, it binds for a little bit and it lets go. So sort of a weak attraction. But for some reason, capsaicin has a very strong affinity for nociceptors. So it binds and doesn't let go.
Ever?
Eventually it will, yeah. But it's on a time scale that's practically like never letting go, relative to other molecules. So when you eat something spicy, that sensation is really based on the beginning of activation of pain sensation, but it doesn't persist. Normally when you feel pain for an extended period of time, it's because things are binding to and letting go of, and binding to and letting go of, and binding to and letting go of, and binding to and letting go of nociceptors. And capsaicin binds and doesn't let go. It does eventually, but if you've ever eaten something spicy, and especially right around the edge of your lips, it is a little bit painful. That's because the capsaicin is bound to those receptors there, but it's not letting go. Now, interestingly, capsaicin is used as an nope, that's not the word I'm looking for. Analgesic, that's what I'm looking for. As a pain blocker. Okay? If you're familiar with the term capsaicin, most likely it's because you've heard of the topical cream called capsaicin. And that's used by people that have arthritis, and they can rub capsaicin cream onto their joints, and that'll bind to the pain receptors in their joints, blocking the prostaglandins that are being made because of the inflammatory response that's part of arthritis. And it'll block the pain reception, and the arthritis won't hurt anymore. So that's one way of, that capsaicin interacts with our pain system. Then the last one there is osmoreceptor, which is referring to water receptors. Osmolarity or osmolality are two terms referring to the concentration of fluids, I guess is one way to put it. And so osmo is referring to water as in osmotic pressure. And so these are receptors that are sensitive to water. Some sources will talk about osmoreceptors being related to taste, but really not. There are osmoreceptors in the tongue and throat, which are sensitive to how much water you're taking in, but they're not a taste receptor in the sense of the other things that we have tastes for. You don't taste water. Your brain is aware when you're taking water in, but it doesn't have anything to do with your experience of foods that you're ingesting. Okay? So it's really separate from taste. Taste receptors are really just chemoreceptors. And you could make a case for osmoreceptors being a type of chemoreceptor since water is a chemical. But so there it is. Now this is not an exhaustive list of receptor cells classified by transduction, but it's a good introduction to it. If you see this kind of word, something receptor, it is not exteroreceptor, interoreceptor, or proprioceptor. It's probably describing some sort of transduction mechanism. And usually you can just look at the first part of the word and know what it's transducing.
Can you explain the chemoreceptor again?
I am going to in a little bit. So where I want to go from this is I want to talk about the different types of senses and address how some of these work. So I'm going to give you examples of these particular things. Now, if you stop somebody on the street and you ask them, what are your senses? You're probably going to hear these 5 senses. Okay? I'm going to start with taste, and then smell, and then touch, and sight and sound. Okay? This is actually not a very accurate way of representing what the senses are. I've often heard reference to there being 17 senses. I have actually tried to come up with a good list of 17 senses, and I either have to start adding things in like sense of humor, or I have too many to go. So I don't know if 17 is a great representation of that, but the idea is when you talk about a sense of something, oh, I'll get back to that picture. A sense of something like taste, which is officially called gustation, there's actually 5 senses related to that. Okay? And so instead of just 5 senses, that I just say, we can break those 5 senses down into a number of different things. And especially the sense of touch. There's a lot of different aspects of touch, which I'll mention in a little bit. Now, I just skipped over a picture that shows you the structure of the tongue and taste buds. I'm actually not going to go back to that because I already kind of showed you taste buds a second ago. And that picture's out of a different book, so we'll just get away from that. There's a picture in the book that shows the tongue and taste buds and their relationship and that sort of thing. But I really want to talk more about transduction and how we transduce these things. I like to start with taste because it's a great way to introduce the idea of transduction. These 5 tastes here fall into kind of 2 groups. There's the very, very simple group of, the most straightforward way that you can cause membrane potentials to change. And then the other group is the more common way that we see it happening everywhere else. So let me just talk about these. And I'm actually going to start with the sense of salt, which is really a sense of the concentration of sodium ions. Whoops. hold on. I was supposed to zoom in. Supposed to zoom in right here. So it's the sense of sodium concentration in your saliva. Now what I've done here, what I've written here, sodium Na plus with brackets around it, that officially means sodium concentration. As that increases, we sense a more salty taste in our food, and as it decreases, we have a less salty taste in our food. Now, salt, when we think of salt, we're usually thinking of table salt or sodium chloride, and so obviously that's where the sodium comes from. Our sense of the salty taste has nothing to do with chloride. It's all about sodium. But this is a great example of the most simple way of explaining transduction. Now, I'm going to be doing something over and over again this semester, which is to expect that you learn something in AP 1. And here's a good example of that first thing that I expect you know. When a cell, neuron, whatever, becomes electrically active, what's the first step in what's happening changing the membrane potential? It's the first thing that happens. So I'm talking about action potentials, but let's break it down. What's the first thing that happens for an action
channels
potential?
have to open and sodium.
So yeah, channels open and
the sodium
is moving through. Okay. So what's happening here for the sense of taste, of salty taste, is simply that when sodium concentration increases in your saliva, there's going to be a stronger gradient pushing sodium into these cells. Now, the taste receptors for salty taste have sodium channels in their membrane that are always open. So you're used to hearing about gated channels, like the voltage gated sodium channel or something like that. Here, we don't have gated channels, they're just always open. And so anytime that sodium concentration in your saliva goes up, it's going to activate these cells because sodium rushes into the cell and its positive charge depolarizes the cell. Okay, it's the first step of any change in membrane potential. And just if you take a grain of salt and you put it on your tongue, as that sodium chloride crystal starts to dissolve, you get sodium ions in your saliva and they start to rush into these cells and they activate and that tastes salty. Anything that contains sodium that can be ionized will have that effect. Okay? So there are some things like monosodium glutamate, or MSG, which doesn't taste salty exactly because the sodium that's part of that molecule doesn't become a sodium ion when it gets dissolved in solution. But anywhere that sodium ions are present, you'll have that sense. So if you take, I think it's Rolaids. If you have heartburn or something like that, you take Rolaids. Rolaids is sodium carbonate, okay? So that's gonna taste salty as you put it in your mouth. You're taking it because the carbonate is gonna help to neutralize stomach acid. But I think it's Rolaids that tastes salty. Tums doesn't because Tums is calcium carbonate, not sodium carbonate, so it doesn't taste salty. But anything that has sodium ions associated with it is going to taste salty. Now, the sense of sour, oh shoot, I keep have this set up right. The sense of sour is the same kind of idea, but instead of it being about sodium ions, it's about hydrogen ions. Now, what I've drawn on the board here is brackets around H+. So that means the concentration of hydrogen ions. How do we measure, or what do we call the measurement for the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution? pH. Right? Things that are sour are anything that have an acidic component to them. And it works just like salty, except that it's about hydrogen ions instead of sodium ions. A hydrogen ion and a sodium ion have the exact same charge. So whichever ion crosses the membrane, it's going to cause the inside of the cell to depolarize when it enters. So salty taste receptors have sodium channels. Sour taste receptors have hydrogen ion channels. Okay? And so it works the same way. It's just straight transduction, immediately depolarizing the cell. That's going to lead to the release of neurotransmitters onto the gustatory afferent nerve. which is going to go on to let your brain know that you tasted something salty or sour. Okay. Now, the other three, sweet, bitter, and savory, are based on the other sort of idea. And for the most part, what's happening here is what we're used to when we think of receptors. Now, in AMP1, when you heard receptor, you usually thought of the membrane protein like a neurotransmitter receptor. Or hopefully that's what you got out of it. That's what we're talking about here. So sweet receptors are cells that contain receptors in their membranes that bind to glucose. Or bitter receptors are cells that contain proteins in their membrane that bind to a class of molecules called plant alkaloids. And then savory contains receptors. Savory receptor cells contain receptors in their membrane that bind to amino acids. So sweet, obviously, has to do with sugar. Bitter, things that are bitter are usually plant substances, and they contain in them molecules that are unique or more common in plants, and we can sense their presence, and that's what we think of as bitter. Now, bitter is usually not a pleasant taste, and the reason for the bitter taste is usually for us to spit food out. So if you put something in your mouth and it tastes bitter, your reaction is because most likely plant matter that you might be ingesting is going to be toxic, so you want to spit it out. Okay? Now, there are plenty of plants that we know of that are not toxic, and so we have developed, let's call it agriculture, to use those to get nutrition. And we usually cover the bitterness up with something else. Okay, so think about like broccoli. Broccoli by itself is actually a fairly bitter food to eat.
Rhubarb. Kale. Rhubarb is.
Well, let's stick with broccoli because that's what we're talking about. Okay. So you will put butter or cheese or something like that on the broccoli so that it doesn't taste as bitter as it would. Or a discussion that I had in graduate school with some of my other graduate students, and this is the kind of discussion you have in graduate school after class, is all bitter substances, and this is actually not true, but this is how the discussion started. All bitter substances that we ingest, we mask with something else. So coffee is very bitter, but you add cream and sugar to it. Tea is very bitter, you add honey or sugar or cream, whatever to it. The only bitter thing that we will ingest that we don't mask the bitter taste with is beer. Okay. Now, that's your basic grad school kind of conversation. And after class, you go to the bar, you start drinking the beer. So you start talking about beer. It's probably not true. There are probably other things, and there are people that drink coffee black and that sort of thing. But bitter generally is something that is meant to be repulsive, and we want to get it out of our mouth, and we have to either accommodate ourselves to that taste and convince ourselves that we love the taste of that bitter vegetable, or we mask it with something else. And interestingly, a little bit after those graduate school conversations, the bar that we went to, they started getting in this beer called Framboise, I think it was, which was a raspberry beer, and it tasted like raspberry syrup. Okay? And so it just completely blew that conversation out of the water, because that was beer that should have been bitter, but it was we were masking with that. And we drank a lot of that Framboise that summer. It was pretty good stuff. Savory is a sense that is actually kind of new to talking about senses. Now, it's new in the sense, that's a kind of a bad pun, I guess. It's new in meaning that at one time when we talked about taste, we talked about the 4 tastes. And then actually somewhere around when I was in school, savory got added to that. Now, it's not actually called savory. Its real name is umami, which is a Japanese word. But a good translation of the word umami from Japanese is savory. And it's basically our sense of amino acids. So savory foods are going to be proteinaceous foods, like meat and those kind of things.
Proteinaceous?
Containing protein.
Oh.
Yeah. The story behind this sense is actually kind of interesting. So it was starting to become part of an understanding of taste, like I said, when I was in school, which was only a couple or few decades ago. It was actually discovered more than 100 years ago. I think it's 1906 is when it was discovered. It was discovered by some Japanese researchers. And so one of the things that happens in science is when you discover something, you get to name it. And so it's named with a Japanese word because they're Japanese researchers. And the word they used, umami, is actually not a Japanese word. It's two Japanese words or word roots that they put together. It almost directly translates to mean tastes good, or something like that, which would be kind of what savory means. That's where it came from. But it took, what would that be? 80 or 90 years for that to make it into the textbooks because people just weren't ready to accept that, yes, there is a fifth taste present. But that's been established. Now, I like to make a little disclaimer when I'm talking about this because there's a possibility that in the near future, this list will grow by one more. We might start talking about a sixth taste, which is a taste of lipids. I don't believe that's going to happen. Now, I say that with all sorts of surety, positivity, whatever. And I'm the kind of person that will be talked about in a couple of decades as, they used to say that there are only five senses, five tastes. But I don't think it's going to happen because the taste of lipids doesn't make sense for humans. Now, there probably is a taste for lipids in something like a rat.
What about like, if the lipids are fat, what about like grease?
But you don't taste grease. For us, lipids that are a component of our food are more about the texture of that food. And a good example of that is ice cream. Okay? The more creamy the ice cream is, the better mouthfeel it's going to have. And that's in fact a formal term that ice cream scientists use to describe ice cream. And if you're thinking, well, who's an ice cream scientist? There is a degree that you can get from Penn State University on ice cream science. People that work for Ben & Jerry's and those kinds of things, they went to school at Penn State. Now, Penn State's in the middle of nowhere. If you ever happen to drive through Pennsylvania, you go by, it's not called State College. I can't remember the town. But wherever, it's like geographically in the middle of Pennsylvania, where nobody actually lives. But if you ever go through there, stop off at Penn State. They have a creamery there that has the best ice cream in the world. And you can actually buy some, and they'll give you dry ice blocks to help you keep it cold as you drive to where you
my major.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an amazing place. I went there for a conference once, and so I got to taste their. And seriously, people that graduate from that program do go to work at the major ice cream companies that we have, like Ben & Jerry's or whatever. And they make amazing ice cream. But
Do they make amazing money?
Yeah, that's a.
I imagine they make money kind of on the scale of like, a creamy that you might buy. Like up in Sunderland, there's this creamy that's open, that opens in May. And all winter you drive by and, they have the picnic tables all stacked up. And you drive by, I want some ice cream. And then when they finally open, it just gets swamped.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the money that the creamery at Penn State probably makes. Because they're local, they don't ship out. But they train people that become part of national brands.
You gotta move somewhere warm where you can work all year.
Anyways, that all came out of using the term mouthfeel, which is actually something that you use to describe ice cream. So good ice cream has good mouthfeel because it's creamy, because it has a lot of lipids in it. And really that's more how we process that aspect of lipids that we ingest.
So why did you say it would work for rats?
Well, so rats have a different diet than us. Rats and humans are both omnivores. We can eat anything. But rats are scavengers. Humans are hunter-gatherers. Rats are interested in finding the most caloric food possible. So lipids are a very important part of their diet so they can get good food. If rats can eat freely without having to search for food, they get really fat. And unfortunately, I have personal experience with that. I used to work in this lab that studied caloric restriction in diet, and we had control rats that were allowed to eat all the food they wanted, and they became like 3-pound rats. They were just amazing. And they were the meanest rats you've ever met. For some reason, the breed of rat used is a typical white lab rat. It's these brown, wharf rats, and they're really nasty rats, but they're appropriate for that type of research. But anyway, but yeah, rats are looking for lipid-rich foods because there's a lot of energy in that food. So they might have a taste for lipids so that when they get food, they can tell that there's a high content of lipids in it. We do that for sweets, actually. Glucose is the primary fuel source for our brains. Other tissues in our body can use carbohydrates, proteins, or lipids for energy. But in our brains, we only use carbohydrates because lipids are required for myelin. If you start breaking down myelin, then your brain stops working properly, or your nervous system stops working properly. If you start breaking down proteins, then the structure of neurons starts to suffer because proteins are important for keeping dendrite shape and axon shape and cell shape and all that. So in your brain now, you're allowed to use the other types of macromolecules. Everything has to be powered by carbohydrates or glucose primarily. So while rats are very sensitive to lipid content in food, we're very sensitive to glucose content in food. And so sweet is one of our major receptors.
So when you bite into a cheeseburger and it's really greasy.
Again, it's about the consistency, the feel of the food. You're not tasting the lipid. It's a juicy.
Feel the.
Yeah, it's a juicy hamburger or something like that. Yeah. So it's not about what it tastes like. You're tasting the savory aspect of the proteins in the meat or the cheese. You're tasting the carbohydrates that are in the bun or whatever. So you're not tasting the lipids. It's a component of the food, but it's not about how we taste it. Now, it's entirely possible in a couple of decades that this list might include a sixth thing. I don't expect it to happen, but it was discovered recently that we have genes for lipid receptors in our genome. There's no evidence that we use those genes, and I don't think we do. It's probably just something common for all mammals, and humans just don't need it. But we might find in the future that they are used a little bit somewhere. So, now I want to talk about the other senses. I spend a lot of time talking about taste. One, because people are usually often very interested in it. And two, it really sets up the way that transduction happens pretty much everywhere else. Either we have transduction where ions are directly allowed to enter into the cell, or we have transduction because some sort of receptor interacts with the stimulus from the environment around us. So I'm just going to talk about the other ones kind of quickly. And I'm going to skip the tongue again. So smell is really just about chemical receptors, chemoreceptors. The olfactory epithelium is in the superior nasal cavity. And there are neurons in that epithelium which have dendrites sticking off into the mucosa, into the mucus laying on the apical surface of the mucosa. These would be technically considered free nerve endings too. But these are very specialized. We just call these olfactory receptors or something like that. Their axons go through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and synapse in the olfactory bulb, which is in the cerebrum. Interestingly, these cells do not have a very long lifespan. It's a very unique situation. These cells live for 3 weeks, 3 months, something like that, and they're replaced. It's very unusual to have neurons that don't live out your entire lifespan. And the reason for that is that what you inhale can be toxic to these cells. And so they have built in a short lifespan, and the new ones grow in and replace them. What's interesting about that is that the axons of new neurons have to find their way along the olfactory nerve to plug into the olfactory bulb. And And that is very unusual. And there's some research happening these days to use olfactory nerve components to help stimulate regrowth of central nervous system damage. Like somebody gets in an accident and they break part of their spinal cord. There might be something about the olfactory nerve that'll help that grow back. There has to be something present for the nerves to grow along. So if the olfactory nerve is completely severed, people lose their sense of smell. Okay? The loss of the sense of smell is called anosmia. N-O-S, like the word nose, is a root. So A at the beginning, meaning without, an-os, and then mia, referring to it being a condition. People will lose their sense of smell for various reasons. Any blunt force trauma to the head, anything that causes impact here, might make the cribriform plate and the olfactory bulb move relative to each other, and that might tear through the olfactory nerve. It's very common for people who are professional boxers. Okay, you hit the head enough time, you're going to start damaging things, and so losing the sense of smell is one of the first things that happens. It's something that can happen with automobile accidents too, and it's something that happens with old age. So in old age, it's not about blunt force trauma, but rather as these cells get older and older, they lose their ability to regrow. So blue-haired little old ladies that go to dinner at 4:30 in Florida, they probably don't have a sense of smell. And the wait staff at the restaurant that serves them knows that. And they put lots of salt shakers out on the table. Okay, a lot of our experience of food has to do with our sense of smell. Okay, I just showed you the tastes that we're sensitive to. There's only 5 of them, and 2 of them are bad. Sour and bitter are not really tastes that people want. So if you can't taste food because you can't smell it, it's bland. You have to add something to it. Now you could add sugar to it, but there's only so many things that benefit from being sweeter. But adding salt usually makes most things taste better. So those blue-haired little ladies eating dinner at 4:30, you're going to put a lot of salt on their food. Okay? And the wait staff knows that, and they put it out beforehand so that they don't get lots of complaints about it before dinner starts. Unfortunately, of course, high sodium intake is going to also cause problems with the cardiovascular system, so it's not the greatest solution. But when you lack olfactory inputs because you've lost your sense of smell, to make food taste better, you have to introduce a taste stimulus. And there's only 5, and really of those, salt is the only one that's going to have a positive effect on food. So, okay. Every so often this kind of freezes up. So I might have to jump out of it and back in. Okay, so the next sense is what we would refer to as a sense of touch, but more appropriately call that the somatosensation of the sense of our body. And there are a bunch of components of that. So touch, we really are thinking about pressure, itch, vibration, tickle, temperature, pain. Proprioception falls under this group also, although we don't usually think of that as our sense of touch. That's our sense of body position and movement that I was talking about earlier. Now, this is where mechanoreceptors come into play for the most part. If we're talking about pressure, if I'm pushing against the palm of my hand with my thumb here, what I'm doing is I'm physically or mechanically compressing my skin. And so lamellated corpuscles, which we can see off to the side on the screen there, are layers and layers of connective tissue that just get squeezed. And as that squeezes in, it squeezes the nerve ending in the middle. And in the nerve ending's membrane, there are channels that when the cell physically changes shape, it might squeeze the channel and the channel will pop open and allow sodium ions to enter. There's a depiction of that in the nervous tissue chapter, and the way that I have it depicted in the artwork, it looks kind of like a trash can with a lid. So without the pressure, the lid's closed, and when you squeeze the cell, the lid pops open. That's a mechanical change. Okay? And we could describe other situations like that for the other aspects of mechanical or physical touch. Temperature and pain are their own sort of things. Thermoreceptors or nociceptors. And then proprioception is going to be mechanoreceptors also, but they're going to be those special kind of in-between receptors. And they're usually stretch receptors. So for a stretch receptor, instead of pressure squeezing the cell and popping a channel open, if we stretch the cell out, that can also cause a channel to open up too. Another place where we see mechanoreceptors, I already showed you that picture earlier. Oh, this is muscle receptors and a tendon receptor, again from another book, but just different versions. I want to skip vision. Talking about mechanoreceptors, another place where we see mechanoreceptors is in the inner ear. Now, the inner ear is actually responsible for more than just audition in the sense of hearing. There are two components to the 8th cranial nerve. It's called the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulo is referring to this part of the inner ear, which is for our sense of balance. And cochlea is referring to this thing, looks like a snail shell, called the cochlea, which is where hearing is processed. Both areas process information the same way at the transduction level. They use what are called hair cells, which I discuss in the book quite a bit. At the apical, oh, actually, there's a little picture for that here. Okay, so this is a scanning electron micrograph of what are called stereocilia, these little hair-like extensions off the top of a hair cell. They're not really cilia, that's just what they're called. And then here's two in a transmission electron micrograph at very, very high power, side by side. And if you look closely, there's a very thin filament right here. Okay? Now, this is depicting that same thing down below. The filament is a protein that connects a taller stereocilium to its shorter neighbor. And where it's connected to the shorter neighbor, there's a channel at that connection point. If the stereocilia move towards the taller stereocilium in the group, then there will be tension added to this little filament connection. And that tension will cause these channels to open up, and sodium rushes in. If the stereocilium bend the other direction, this filament will become slack, and tension will be released, and these channels will close. Okay, so the plus and minus signs here are talking about when the stereocilia move this direction, it increases activity of the cell, the membrane depolarizes. When it moves this way, it inhibits the cell, the membrane might not necessarily hyperpolarize, but it's not going to generate a membrane potential change that will eventually lead to action potentials. Okay. So this is an example, a specific example of a mechanoreceptor. And these are what we find in the inner ear. When sound waves are making these cells vibrate, that's how we hear things. And when your head moves, these are positioned in a way that they're going to move relative to how your head rotates or your head position, both of which are described in the book in a bit of detail there. But that's a good example of mechanoreceptor. I talk about the pressure thing and that, and I don't have pictures to really depict that, but this is a good depiction of mechanoreceptors, and specifically the ones that are in the inner ear for that. So, I happen to find this picture online, and it's a good depiction of these connections. Because I've shown you this picture, don't think that means that I expect you to know the names of these particular components. Don't worry about that. I just want you to understand what the system looks like. Okay. I'm not going to ask you any questions where any of those terms are an answer to it, so don't worry about it.
So mechanoreceptor pressure, basically pressure, any type of pressure.
Any type of physical change. So pressure is when you compress something.
Mm-hmm.
Stretch would be the opposite of that.
Okay.
And then this is a specialized cell that responds to movements of the stereocilia sticking out of the top of the cell.
Okay. So stretching and pressure. and this,
Any physical change.
any physical change. Okay.
There's a little bit more I actually go into, and I don't want to waste this joke, but so I showed you the 5 senses. If we're going to stick with those 5 senses, there's a 6th sense. Now, it isn't seeing dead people. It's actually something I already talked about. The real 6th sense in terms of taste, smell, touch, sight, and sound is balance or equilibrium. And this is just showing you some more pictures, sort of how those hair cells work. So I'm not going to go into any detail about this. I explained in the book plenty. If you want to look at this picture in more detail, it's from a different book, but you can see the presentation on your own if you want to. Any questions at this point? Okay, so like I said, I meant to, and I usually on this first day, set up some examples of sensory perceptions that you could experience. I forgot to do that. It actually worked out well because it gave me time to talk about this stuff that I like this, this is sort of the stuff I want to stress about this material. The types of receptors and how we transduce those signals in the major senses here. I might have our lab people upstairs help me and set up those things. And I think if I do that, I'll have them available maybe after class next week. There won't be time in class to do it, but if you're interested, you can stick around after class. And I'll have stuff up and show you. But otherwise, thank you, and I'll see everybody next week. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions in the intervening week. You too.